All right, now we're going to set up the camera for proper exposure and white balance using one of our targets. And as I mentioned, there are 4 different sizes. They all work essentially the same way. However, there are some situations where one works better than another. And in this situation, because I'm working so close with my light source, I probably don't want to be using the large target, because when I position this in front of my subject, my highlight area is actually quite a bit closer to the light source than where my subject's face is. So probably not a good choice. Chances are what I would probably use here would be either a 14 or a 24. Now, again, you can use any of these targets in any of these situations. Basically what you would do with the large target here is you'd make sure that the highlight is over the subject's face, because that's what we want to key on, is the highlight spike in the histogram. For myself, I do prefer to offset the highlight spike very close to the edge of the histogram. Again, that gives me the widest tonal range, but again, it's a matter of personal preference. How do you like your files looking coming out of the camera? The goal is to get your files coming out of the camera that you don't have to touch them. You don't have to click balance for white balance. You don't have to adjust the exposure. So this, again, is just a kind of cumbersome size for a single individual. The 14 or the 24 would work fine. Because I'm working with a fixed focal length lens on the camera, I'm using the 85-1.2, the new Canon lens that just came out. The Mini would probably be a bad choice, only because I can't come in and fill up the frame with that lens and actually get it in focus. And I'll show you an alternative to that, but in this situation, I'm probably going to go with the 24. I think the 24 is probably one of the most versatile for studio use. The 34 generally, this is great for large family groups, that kind of thing. A lot of commercial photographers prefer the very large target depending on what it is that they're photographing. So we're going to go with the 24 to start with. Little target basics. We've got a key light coming in from one side. If you have a directional light, always set up so that the highlight of the target is towards your light source. So I'm just going to have her hold that right there. And we're going to push this in. So I'm going to push my camera in so that I can actually fill the frame with this target. I'm going to go ahead. I know how this camera performs, but in this situation, I'm actually going to go ahead and I'm going to expose this perfectly for the 18% gray. And all that means is that my meter is going to be dead center as I meter off of this gray, just to show you that the meter isn't always accurate. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to take an exposure of that, and we're going to look at the histogram. So I'm going to press my info key and bring up my histogram. And in this situation, my histogram is actually slightly offset to the underexposed side. As I said, I like to favor the highlights. So what I'm probably going to do is I'm going to try to take this up probably 2/3 of a stop is where I think I'm going to prefer it to be. So I'm going to go ahead and bring that up. And we're shooting at a 60th at 3.2. And I'll shoot that again. And I'm just on the edge of clipping. So that's probably a little higher than where I want to be. I pushed it just a touch too much, so we'll bring it back down. But again, in my meter, I'm actually overexposing, according to the meter, by 1/3 of the stop to get the histogram that I really want. So we're going to take that one more time. And that's the histogram, or the look of the histogram that I want to achieve. From that, I'm simply going to hit my menu button. I'm going to select custom white balance on the camera. It's asking me for a reference. That's the image that I want to reference. I'm going to go ahead and reference that image. And now my custom white balance is set. So I have a perfect exposure and I have a perfect white balance. So I'm going to go ahead and drop the target out of this. And we'll make that exposure. And what we've got is what looks to be, if you were just to look at the histogram on the back of the camera now, you would think that this image is underexposed, because in our Canon manual on histograms, they're telling us that an image that has a histogram that looks like this is probably a very dark underexposed image. But in fact, we know that this is perfectly exposed for the highlights and the shadows on the subject's face, because we put the target in that position, and so we are recording all the detail that we need to record in this image. Now, as I mentioned before, we could possibly use this mini target, and I won't be able to fill the frame, and you're going to have to test with your own camera to find out whether this will work or not. On all of the Canons, you can actually fill just about the center third of the image area and still be able to ascertain whether you have a good exposure through the histogram spike and get a good custom white balance, because on the Canon cameras, the center area of the frame is where the custom white balance is derived from. So we don't actually have to fill the frame in order to do this. So what I'm going to do is we're going to actually make an exposure and a white balance with the Mini, but I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to turn off these daylight balance fluorescents, and we're going to bring in tungsten. So we're going to see a drastic change in terms of what the lighting looks like. Now to the video cameras, I'm going to leave the video cameras set up as they are. You'll see the big shift in color temperature when we plug in the tungsten, yet my images coming out of the camera are going to look identical to the ones that we shot with the daylight balance fluorescence. So we're going to go ahead and unplug these and move them out of the way and bring in some tungsten lights. Okay, so what we've done is we've replaced our key light and our hair light with now tungsten light sources, and obviously you can see this is very, very warm color temperature. I'm going to go ahead and leave my background with the daylight balance fluorescence, which is actually going to give us a blue cast in that background now, so we're going to get kind of a pretty blue, I think, back there, a cooler tone. But once again, two lights, reflector is all that we've got going on here. Before I actually correct the camera or create a custom white balance for the camera, I'm going to set the exposure for the tungsten the way that we are. I'm going to make one exposure with the tungsten so that we can see it. Then I'll go ahead and set my custom white balance and reference the target image. So go ahead and we're going to go ahead and get our exposure first, and if you would, let your fingers go just on either side so you're not covering up too much of that target, okay? And I'm not going to be able to fill the frame here. I'm going to go ahead and push in as close as I can possibly get it, though. Okay, this is the absolute maximum that I can go in on this and still keep the target in focus. And again, I've only got about a third of the image area covered, but we're going to go ahead and adjust our exposure, and we're going to bring that down just a touch. And what I'm seeing is I can still see where my highlight spike is, and it's just about exactly where I want it to be. And what I did is, again, I've overexposed this particular image by about a third of the stop based on what my meter reading is giving me, but that's setting up the histogram just about where I want it to be. Now, I'm not going to set a custom white balance. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take an image, so go ahead and let me have that target. A little lower, 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 lower. There you go. And what we're seeing is a really warm image. What I'm actually going to do with this is I'm going to take this now and I'm going to reference my target. I'm going to hit the menu button, custom white balance. It always brings up the last image by default, but I can actually dial back on that image to my image of the target, and once again I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to reference that. I've now just set my custom white balance, and let's go ahead and take another image. And you can see that this image has a beautiful white balance there. I mean, it's exactly the same as what we had in our previous images. Now, I will give you one caution. When you make a shift of such drastic color temperature from daylight, which is where we were, to this very warm tungsten, it's really kind of advisable to go back and shoot the target a second time after you've set your custom white balance, because quite often that shift in color temperature will also affect the exposure. So I'm going to go ahead and we're just going to take a quick shot just to kind of prove this out, and just to make it easy on ourselves, we'll go back to the 24-inch target. So could you just hold that right there for me? And we can see that actually we've got a really evenly balanced exposure here. I might give it a little more exposure. I'm not quite where I was with my histogram spike. My histogram spike was a little tighter to the highlight side, but very acceptable exposure in here. And notice the neutrality of the target, that when we set that custom white balance, even though we were referencing what looked to be a horribly off-color target, that's exactly what happens in a custom white balance. It looks at the image and says, I want to render this neutral. It saves those settings and then applies that to all future images, and so that's what we've accomplished here. Next thing we'll do is we'll shoot a couple of images with flash, just to once again give us a major shift from the tungsten now back to flash. So I'm going to reset up my lights, turn on my flash units, and I'll show you how to set up for flash with the target. Okay, where flash is concerned, you can do one of two things. You can kind of go trial and error just using the target, shooting, seeing your histogram, adjusting your exposure accordingly. I find that it's a little more efficient with flash if you happen to have an incident light meter that records for flash. So I do have this meter set up for flash. And what I want to do is just check my main light, my hair light. I know where a hair light is concerned with her color hair that I want that to be about a stop under what my main light is going to be, because the angle of incidence will actually increase the reflectance value of that. So that's where I want it to be. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to take a quick light reading off of her face. It's giving me f5.6 as the exposure for her face. I'm going to check my ratio now on the hair light, and we're going to just block this so that we're not going to affect it. And I've got that at f4. So 5.6, f4, one stop under, which is exactly where I said I wanted it to be. Once again, we don't have I haven't set up a strobe. You know, if I were actually doing this, I'd set up a strobe for my background light. I'm going to go ahead and leave the fluorescence, but unfortunately, that fluorescent needs to be down around 2.8 in order to really record our f2 probably at 1/25th, which is what I'm going to be shooting at. So our background in this image is probably going to go pretty dark and be kind of dead in this image. But again, what we're concerned about is what's happening with the subject. I'm not teaching you how to light here. I'm just showing you how to get the exposure and the white balance proper for your subject area, whatever that might be. So I'm going to go ahead and now I'm going to shoot the target, and I'm going to set my camera at f5.6, which we will do right here. And in actuality, this is looking like it's probably a bit overexposed. We're clipping our highlights, but we haven't set our custom white balance yet. And so again, there might be a slight shift. So what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and set my custom white balance for that one. So let's go in, set the custom white balance, and that's the image that I want to use. Go ahead and hold the target for me again. I'm going to take another shot of the target at the exact same exposure. Let's see if this histogram shifts at all on us. And no, we're still overexposed in this instance. And once again, we took one of the finest light meters on the market and took our flash reading. It said shoot it at f5.6, but in my opinion, this is looking like it's almost a full stop. I'm going to try 2/3 of a stop and see if that brings it into alignment. So we'll just go in here and we're going to change that up 2/3 of a stop. So I'm now at 7.1. We'll take another exposure. And that looks pretty dead on. It's slightly offset to the right-hand side, which is where I like my histogram to be. So we're favoring that highlight side, but we're totally containing it in that image. I'm going to go ahead, just for jollies, we're going to go ahead and set that custom white balance one more time, referencing a properly exposed target, because quite honestly, if you have an image that's overexposed, which meant that those whites were blown out, you're not actually going to get the most accurate white balance. It's very important that your whites not be overexposed in the image area. So I'm going to, once again, set my custom white balance one more time, and we're all set up, ready to go. I'll just pull that back. That's great, just like that. Yeah, that looks good. And the subject exposure is perfect. Color balance is perfect. All three of these, even though we shot with totally different color temperatures, the flash, the fluorescence, and the tungsten will all match up almost identically when we look at these images in the flesh tone area, even though the color temperatures themselves are drastically different.